Following the Hill trade, we had obviously this boost of enthusiasm for Juju Smith-Schuster. I think that is justified. But then the next shoe to drop was the signing of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And Colm, this really came down to, I think, the Chiefs and the Packers. The Packers were interested. They talked again, yesterday about how they need to have that player who can take the top off of the defense. Kind of start us out by giving us your thoughts on what this means for the Packers. The Packers obviously being a little bit more patient, as they often are. I think that's probably good, right? The Chiefs don't want to. And one of the things we talked about on the show is the Chiefs don't want to turn around and take advantage of all of the things that they saved and all the things that they gained through the Hill trade and then immediately waste it, save that kind of thing. And so good and bad with the MVS signing for the Chiefs. We'll get to that in a second. But what does it mean for the Green Bay Packers?
In terms of what it means for the Packers at this point, when he was out last year, they didn't have that speed option. They lacked speed in that offense, and he is a major part of what they were trying to do. They scored more points with him in the offense. They looked better, more balanced with him in the offense. But I think it's interesting what's happened with the Packers over the last 2 weeks or so. And of course, they've traded Davante Adams, and now they've lost MVS in free agency. And I think obviously that makes their receiving core weaker when they lost basically their two best receivers. So it's not an ideal situation for the Packers. I think you hinted at it there in terms of how the contract played out. 3-year, $30 million contracts, so we're averaging $10 million a year. I think in this situation, based on, I think the Christian Kirk's contract kind of skewed the market a bit. Then with Davante Adams is dealing, then with Tyreek Hill's deal, and everyone's looking to get their piece of the pie. So I feel like it might be a little bit rich for MVS on this contract, but I can see what the Chiefs are trying to do and replace some of that speed they immediately lost, but potentially could still be done through the draft. And I think that might be where the Packers are approaching it. I think we'll let that play out. Though I mentioned at the start of the show, it's kind of 4 weeks to the NFL draft. We've seen what has happened over the last 4 weeks. The landscape can change very quickly. We could have a situation where come the NFL draft, the Packers have already taken in 1 or 2 veteran free agents, and then that might change what they need to target. But I think we're going to see the Packers look to add speed through the draft. That was one of their weaknesses in this offense last year. I think they really would like Valdes-Scantling back. He was a key member of the kind of locker room, a key part of that team, and there's no doubt it's a disappointment to lose him, especially after losing out on Davante Adams as well in that trade. So I think it's going to leave the Packers in a weakened state for now, but I think we can't really see how this plays out probably to training camp when we see how the veterans are added to the roster and how they go through the draft. Obviously now 2 first-round picks this year and, of course, 2 second-round picks. And, if they do end up moving those for a younger veteran wide receiver, the picture could change very, very swiftly here. So I'm not ruling out them making those moves, but I think obviously the wide receiver position has to be attacked. With that in mind, obviously I mentioned they have lost Davante Adams, they have lost Marquez Valdes-Scantling, so they're kind of left with a couple of guys, and they're going to need, there's no way around it, they have to add to this roster. I think what it does do at the moment, it opens up a little bit of an opportunity on the running back situation. I think Aaron Jones is probably getting a boost based on the lack of targets or the vacated targets that's there. But is there anything standing out for you when we do look at the Packers now, Shawn, in terms of opportunity? I think Aaron Jones stands out for me. They did re-sign Robert Tonyan, who's coming back off a knee injury. I think if he is healthy, it's going to make things interesting for him based on where the expectations were heading into last season. But at the minute, it's very hard to have much confidence in the direction of the targets in this offense based on what they have lost and still the opportunity to add to this roster at the position.
Yeah, it does become interesting. And you think of the playoff game for Aaron Jones and his ability to just be so explosive with the targets that he gets. And opening that up, having the running backs very involved in the receiving game next year should help both Jones and A.J. Dillon behind him. It wouldn't be surprising if the Packers lead the NFL in terms of expected points to the running back position. The other thing there is that we then look to the passing game and the wide receivers, and the Packers are going to add in the draft and perhaps a lot. And so one of the things that the Chiefs did here by taking MVS is that puts even more of an emphasis on those picks and increases again the value of these 2022 picks in this class, because the Packers are going to draft a receiver that they like, right?
Yeah.
And currently the research suggests that almost anybody they would take in that range is going to be at least solid with a decent amount of upside. And so that receiver then is going to very much be in the mix to be the 101 overall. And one of the things that the Chiefs have done to try to get ahead of the Packers a little bit, since the Packers get to draft a couple times ahead of them, they won't have the pick of the litter at the wide receiver position in the draft. They wanted to add some firepower and some vertical ability. One of the things that we've talked about on the show a number of times is the value of this freak score element. MVS was one of the guys who flashed in that metric when he came out. You look at some of the recent players who have sort of overperformed what their production would have suggested. He would be one of them. Obviously, DK Metcalf, really the best freak score prospect, since we had Calvin Johnson, really. I mean, you're looking back a long way to see someone better than him. But then as well, you have Chase Claypool up there. So some guys who are outperforming. And the Chiefs have emphasized speed. They lose Tyreek Hill, the fastest player in the game, the most dynamic vertical threat, but also obviously a big threat with the ball in his hands type of player. And yet they're adding speed back in right away. We know they also have speed with Mecole Hardman. And so they want that element. They also add speed at the running back position with Ronald Jones. The key, of course, is that MVS isn't Tyreek Hill. He isn't going to bring that variety of route running, the overall ability. But one of the things that they have now with Hardman and Juju Smith-Schuster and MVS are three players who will help them attack different areas of the field. I finally had a chance to get that Juju Smith-Schuster article out last weekend, and there was some serious revision column after the Tyreek Hill trade, but it was still a lot of fun, and MVS wrapped into there. One of the things that we see with these players, and one of the cool things that you will note when you pull up the Player Stat Explorer on the site, you can then go to route location and target location and kind of see how these different players bring specific elements that the Chiefs need. And so Hardman targeted almost exclusively last season underneath MVS, the deep threat. Juju Smith-Schuster, especially if you look at his peak seasons, is that intermediate threat. And the thing that jumped out to me, and again, there's some cherry picking element to this. One of the reasons that the Chiefs were able to sign Smith-Schuster, were able to sign MVS, is that they didn't have their best seasons in 2021. If they had been healthy last season, perhaps they get priced out. You mentioned the contract for Christian Kirk. But last season, Hardman, number 2 in the NFL in terms of yards after the catch per reception. You look at Juju in his peak year, he led the NFL in total yards after the catch. And then you go in and look at MVS, and in 2020, when he was healthier than he was last year, in 2021, he ranked number 4 in yards after the catch per reception. A lot of those deep targets where he catches it and takes it all the way for the score. He was number 2 in terms of air yards per target. And so that element of his game complements nicely all three of these guys with that run after the catch ability, or at least they had that when they were functioning sort of, or firing on all cylinders. And so the key for the Chiefs is how much of that do they get in 2022? How healthy will these guys be? The youth for Smith-Schuster always comes up as something that people are looking for in dynasty leagues and emphasizing in dynasty leagues. And yet at the same time, we have to realize that he had this serious knee injury. He came back more or less right away, just missed a month or so. But then the following season, even though not necessarily another injury, consistent swelling on the injury report with it not being 100%. And his performance has indicated that in a variety of ways. Now, I go into in the article a wide variety of reasons why you have other explanations for it besides just the knee, right? And so there are reasons to think that he could bounce back and he could be that guy, still has the youth, and yet you can't discount these other things that have happened. A 25, 26-year-old, the age doesn't matter if they're no longer the player they were at 22, 23, and the same reason that someone who is 27, 28, or like Travis Kelce, in the 30s, if they're completely healthy and they've stayed healthy and they haven't had some of those problems and they're still the best player at that position in the game, then the age doesn't matter to you as much, with the caveat that obviously you have this potential anytime an injury occurs with a player that's a little bit older, they'll stop getting chances, right? And so that's kind of the big difference age-wise between a player like Juju and an older player like an AJ Green, for example. Now, Green did get more chances than he should have gotten, but in terms of how those targets are going to work out, how the play is going to work out, it's going to be different in terms of the opportunities that you get and the expectations that you have based on when you're hurt and what the likelihood to come back is. Now, Blair has a great article up on the site in his Wrong Read series about the bounce backs and how the older players don't bounce back as often. And part of that is going to be merely opportunity. Their teams aren't willing to take the same chance when they get a little bit older. So a lot of interesting things there. Now, again, you're the huge Packers fan. You watch them all the time very closely. MVS, not quite the same guy in 2021. How much of that is injuries? How much of that is that maybe he outperformed in 2020? The big key would be for him that if you go from Aaron Rodgers to almost anyone else, it's this huge downgrade. But perhaps the situation with Patrick Mahomes is either neutral or a mild upgrade. And so I think from a fantasy perspective, you've got to still be very interested in him, at least as long as the price stays in the same range that you really would expect with the Packers, because it's not going to be a dramatic upgrade from the Packers situation.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Obviously, the only place that you can probably go lateral or potentially even a little bit higher is to go from Rodgers to Mahomes. I think when we're looking at this particular situation, I think a lot of it last year was injury, struggle with back injuries pretty much all season long, missed a lot of game time for the Packers. But as I mentioned earlier, when he was out, the Packers didn't have as explosive of an offense. I think you can see here, like, he's going from, even when he was there last year, kind of playing with Devontae Adams, then he's going to a situation now where even if we say Hill was the Adams, Hill is no longer there. So then we're looking at the number one target being Travis Kelce. And although Juju is also there, I think we're going to see him probably get a little bit more of a target share. And I think he can fit in very well. Like, I think he can do all the speed stuff that Hill does and the deep routes. I think where he doesn't do things as well as when it's underneath or short to, intermediate routes. I think he is kind of one of those prototypical downfield threats that's a home run hitter. So a lot of the times the Packers did use him was on those deep threats. And then the other problem was outside of him, they didn't have a huge amount of options to do that. So I think he can fit in to the Chiefs system quite well. And I think although they may have overpaid for him, I think he will be a valued part of their offense, especially with the need to replace Tyreek Hill. He is not going to replace Tyreek Hill, but it's a situation where they now have Juju Smith-Schuster and MVS for the price of Tyreek Hill. Can they do enough to replace what Hill did as a combined unit? There is a possibility that could make the offense more kind of, I won't say productive, but I would say harder to game plan for. When we seen the games last year where teams tried to take away the deep threat, playing deeper safeties and things like that, it meant that we had some games where the Chiefs were struggling. I think that having the two options in Smith-Schuster and MVS helps maybe to alleviate that a bit. I think that might be somewhere in the planning. Shawn, we've talked about the Chiefs. I guess the last question on the Chiefs is, where do you think the value plays out now in this offense? So before signing with the Chiefs and when drafts were going on, MVS was going in those later rounds. Do you think that this moves him up in value? Then we obviously have Juju Smith-Schuster. Do we think that Juju is the player who's going to earn the most targets here? Or do we think that MVS may be able to step in there and be the wide receiver one in this offense?
Well, we've gotten a lot of sort of misdirect type of reporting on the Chiefs in the last week. And so the signal's pointing a lot of different directions. We've heard that Hardman will be the vertical receiver in the offense, which doesn't make sense based on both his history and his skill set. He would appear to be the guy who can replace those underneath targets that Hill has been dynamic with in the past several years. And in some ways, I mean, this can't help but boost him because now there's a little bit less overlap for that type of play. You think Hardman is so dynamic with the ball in his hands. He's going to be the guy that gets those. They're going to want to use Hill deep, and yet Hill is just so good, and you don't want to let teams take him away that they used him underneath a lot. And so that portion of it, I think, will go to Hardman. It's hard to see him being the vertical threat, especially when you have MVS there. I think that Juju Smith-Schuster is the guy who could end up being the star, right? So we talk a lot about contingency-based drafting. As long as you continue to get decent prices on Juju, you want to have some exposure there. Because if the knee is okay, he's the guy who could bounce back. I mean, this is someone who, over his first couple of years in the NFL, in terms of a player at that age, the 21, 22 sort of time period, only Justin Jefferson was better, right? So we're talking about someone with this crazy background, and that still is the reason why people are so intrigued by what he could potentially do. The issue for him and for MVS in terms of what their values would be is that Travis Kelce is still going to be a big target hog. He's going to be a big part of what they do, and it's going to have some overlap in terms of the areas where they're targeted, and specifically in terms of Juju. The other element here is that we continue to get reports that the Chiefs are out there looking for more players. And I argued very strongly for this, and as a reason that the Chiefs could actually benefit from this trade, could end up being better if they can attack in a lot more different ways. It will benefit their offense as a whole. But it's interesting to hear them, go out and sign MVS, still talking about adding a number one receiver in a trade, and then you have the draft as another potential avenue. The idea that they would get through the offseason without adding another player, that seems pretty unlikely. And so once you put that player into the mix, it's not something, I don't think, where these targets are going to balance out evenly. That's one of the mistakes that fantasy drafters tend to make, is to think, okay, well, the target split is going to make it so none of these players have value. Someone is going to have, but then the rest of the players are actually going to be pretty tricky price-wise, because once it actually works its way out, and again, there's not a Jamar Chase in this draft. You're not going to see players do that kind of thing. But you think about some of the other contributions that players have made in the last several years, with a Justin Jefferson and Jalen Waddle. The idea that a rookie receiver couldn't go in here and be the number one, and maybe number one by a decent margin, especially from midseason on and those highest leverage fantasy playoff weeks, then I think all of these guys end up being pretty tricky values in the end. And then just the other thing that you hear, and this kind of transitions into our running back discussion, but you've also heard that the Chiefs are going to finally use these running backs now in the passing game. The question, of course, they had some opportunities in the first half of last year, and if they were going to do it, why didn't you do it?
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.